This is an Audi S3 and this is an Audi RS3. They're both very fast, they both have quattro all-wheel drive, and they are both excellent cars in their own right. So why then does one cost £39,000 and the other £53,000? In other words, what are the key differences between my long-term Audi S3 Sportback and this Audi RS3 Sportback, which incidentally has just finished a run on Car Magazine's long-term test fleet?
Well, we'll start with the styling because these two clearly look very similar, but there are a few exceptions.
Not least because the S3 is in standard spec, while the RS3 is in the now discontinued Launch Edition spec that in turn was based on the Vorsprung trim. However, if you were to compare the two base spec models, you'd see that the RS3 gets a wider, more aggressive bumper design with enlarged air inlets and the honeycomb grille. There would also be much less silver on show, with only the front diffuser and side blades getting a matte aluminium finish. Move around to the side and there's flared front wheel arches as well as larger 19-inch wheels as standard, while the side skirt once again is in black rather than silver. Finally, the RS3 brake calipers are finished in black as standard, and the rear bumper gets a punchier design as well as just 2 exhaust tips rather than 4 like you get on the S3.
You can also get the black styling pack on the S3 and the RS3, and there's even an option for a carbon roof spoiler depending on how aggressive you want your hot hatch to look.
As for the cabins, both cars are very similar. However, those with an eagle eye will spot slightly different seats, perforated leather all round on the RS3 steering wheel, aluminium look gear shift paddles, different stitching and RS specific graphics on the virtual cockpit system. And although you can't really see it in the daylight, the RS3 also gets the ambient lighting pack fitted as standard.
One thing I've got to mention though, which stands out, is the steering wheel, because this is a Launch Edition car which is based on the Vorsprung spec, and that means it has the round steering wheel rather than the flat bottom option, which for me feels far sportier and more exclusive. This is just like a regular Audi A3, but then again it's exactly the same if you got a Vorsprung S3, you still get this round steering wheel. Apart from that though, the differences in here are really minor, and I do wonder if some RS3 owners might kind of wonder where the extra £14,000 has gone over the S3, because I mean, let's face it, this is where you're going to spend most of your time, and the difference between the cabins is, well, there's hardly anything. The one response to that though would be that Audi's done such a great job with the A3 and therefore the S3 cabin that there's only so much they can realistically do to improve it for the RS3. Yes, some more exclusive materials or design details would have been nice, but for me, on a car like this, the interior's most important job is to provide the perfect support act for the driving experience.
Speaking of how each car drives, in my 2 months with the S3, I've been amazed by its incredible real-world pace. So I'm intrigued to find out if the more aggressive and more powerful RS3 could deliver a discernible difference. After all, there's only so much speed and performance that you can use on an everyday basis.
So I'm in the RS3 now, and I'm going to start with the engine because it probably accounts for a lot of the extra cash over the S3. And the reason for that is because it's a 2.5 litre, 5-cylinder turbocharged petrol. It makes 400 horsepower, 500 Newton meters of torque, and it accelerates from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 3.8 seconds. Probably quicker, but those are the official figures. Now those figures aren't massively different to the previous generation of this car, the 8V, but what you have got is peak power and peak torque being available earlier in the rev range. And what that does is it makes the colossal performance just that much more accessible. It's a really brawny, meaty engine, and because you've got that odd number of cylinders, you've got that offbeat soundtrack which you really don't hear very often. I mean, imagine a 3-cylinder engine with that kind of characterful but still fairly weedy sound. But this has been upscaled. It's got 5 cylinders, and that's more than enough. My only real criticism of this engine is that I think it used to be wilder and louder on previous generation RS3s. Years ago when I was at university, I was working part-time in a garage, and I had to go out in a 2012 RS3 and try and recreate a minor fault. And I remembered it was the first time I'd driven one, and I put my foot down for the first time, and it was like an explosion had happened under the bonnet. I mean, the speed on this car, it's still there, of course it is. It's got a lot more power than it used to back then, but the sense of theatre and drama now, it's still there, but there used to be more. And while I accept that this engine has evolved over the last decade and no doubt been strangled by a numerous amount of regulations to do with emissions, for example, I was expecting just a bit more. And actually, it could also sound a bit better too. It's got the sports exhaust on this car with its fully variable valves, but even then, when you put your foot down, it could be a little bit wilder. I don't know, maybe I'm looking at it through rose-tinted spectacles, but this engine is still good. It's still a very good engine, but for me, it's just not what it once was.
Thankfully, where the engine feels like it's been toned down over the years, the chassis has gone the opposite way. New to this generation of RS3 is a torque splitter system on the rear axle. Designed to improve agility and cornering speeds, it works together with the module vehicle dynamics controller, aka the RS3's electronic brain, and sends increased torque to the outer rear wheel when cornering. And should the car start to unintentionally slide at the rear, torque can be sent to the inside wheel, helping to pull the car straight.
I mean, you can actually feel it working, and hopefully it'll do something to fix that understeery reputation that fast Audis have had, sometimes unfairly, for, well, as long as I can remember. I mean, there's even a drift mode that can send up to 50% of the car's total power to just one wheel in order to initiate a slide. It doesn't feel that natural, but it is effective. And the reason it can do that is because, depending on what drive mode you're in, up to 50% of the car's total power can be sent to the rear wheels, and then the torque splitter will then decide which of those wheels on the back needs the power most. And in that case, it can send up to 100% of that available power to either wheel. It's very clever stuff.
A large part of that is down to the RS adaptive suspension, standard on launch edition and Vorsprung models, and a £960 option. Otherwise, the quality of the damping while driving at speed is hugely impressive.
Overall, the car feels very neutral going into corners, and while it would be nice to have a bit more adjustability on the throttle, it's clear that you can devour any B-road that's put in front of you in this thing. It really is extraordinary how good it is over an unfamiliar road.
So, you've heard what I think of the RS3, now it's time to get back into my S3 long-termer and take it along the exact same roads.
Right, back in familiar territory, back in the S3, and the first thing I've noticed, probably unsurprisingly, is that there's a definite feel of less aggression. Evident in the steering, which I was just going on about in the RS3. In that, it's, you know, you can sneeze and immediately you'll be going off into the nearest bush. But in this, it's a lot smoother, a lot more laid back. Not so much that it feels like a regular Audi A3, because that wouldn't be great in a hot hatch, but enough so it's noticeably slower. Also, the brakes, some of that initial sharpness on the top of the pedal has gone. The road noise is reduced, the engine sound when you're just cruising, that's been taken back a notch. It just feels like a more civilized place to be, which again is as you'd expect. So after hearing all of that this car is softer and more civilized, you're probably thinking, well, it sounds a bit boring. I thought it was supposed to be a hot hatch. Well, the good thing is that when you do start to press on, when you still do drive it like a hot hatch, like you might the RS3, everything comes together really rather nicely. It's got plenty of grip, it's got a huge amount of grip, more than you could really ever want in the real world. It's got adjustability at the back end. It almost feels like it's got a little bit more than the RS3 because perhaps it's not quite so capable. The engine with the augmented sound, that sounds pretty good. It pulls ridiculously hard. I mean, 0 to 62 miles an hour is under 5 seconds. It'll probably do it a bit quicker than that as well if we're talking about the real world figures. The gearbox is good. The brakes do their job. It just comes together to create a car that in the real world, the gap to the RS3 is not as big as you might expect. It is also worth highlighting that the RS3, as you probably saw, was on Trofeo R tyres, which are really quite serious dry weather tyres, which actually work very well on track and on road when it's dry, whereas this S3 is on Pirelli P0s, good tyres but nowhere near as focused. And that meant that the RS3 had a slightly better bite when the tyres were warm on turn-in. But even with the less sticky tyres, I don't think you'd ever say that this thing is lacking grip. The biggest difference going through a corner is the lack of a torque splitter with it rotating that outside rear wheel with extra power. Obviously you don't have that in this. I'm also a big fan of the engine and the gearbox for everyday use because it always seems to know what you want it to do next, and it makes a really good companion for when you're just cruising down a motorway or an A road, but then suddenly you change your mind, you hit a B road and you want to start shifting through the gears. It gets that balance really spot on.
So what's the verdict? Well, driving both the S3 and RS3 back to back confirm that these are some of the best generations of the model that Audi has ever produced. The RS3 is as capable as ever, yet there's an added dose of fun, and the same can largely be said for the S3. However, I really felt like the RS3's adaptive dampers made a big difference, as without them, the S3 didn't have as good a body control or as good a ride or refinement as its more aggressive sibling. So, as tested, the RS3 is definitely worth the extra £14,000. However, give the S3 some adaptive dampers, those Trofeo R tyres and some tweaks to its 2-litre engine, something that we'll cover in a later video, and I really think that it would be a very tough decision choosing between the two.